And the Unicam is designed to ease the financial burden for victims of abuse and their families.
Taylor Johnson joins us with how Nebraska lawmakers aim to keep debt collectors away and how victims can get extra money to help them in the meantime.
Nebraska Senator John Frederickson says abuse victims have enough burdens to deal with, and medical debt shouldn't be one of them.
These are folks who are in acute stages of trauma. We know that sexual assaults, domestic violence, child abuse is underreported. And one thing that we want to ensure is that folks who are in these situations are able to have as minimal barriers to receiving support as possible.
A way he's hoping to eliminate barriers is through Legislative Bill 315. It would keep victims' medical debt related to their abuse from being sent to collections agencies. The bill was written by the Women's Fund of Omaha.
We know that victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse are often sometimes won't go and seek care because they are worried about the financial consequences and their ability to afford health care.
So, how can victims afford it? In 1979, Nebraska started the Crime Victims Reparations Program. Today, nearly $500,000 of federal money is available for abuse victims or their loved ones through the program. But there's only a certain amount victims can apply for.
Healthcare providers can bill that fund up to $5,000 for the cost of care, and it very rarely exceeds that amount. And the victim can apply for an additional amount of money to cover the cost of things like mental health services. If that hospital bill is higher than $5,000, it can cover the cost of lost wages while you were recovering.
So far, LB 315 has no opposition. Senator Frederickson says he's hopeful that the bill will eventually make it to Governor Pillen's desk after next steps.
I'm really optimistic that this is going to get kicked out to the floor on general file for the full body to be able to debate, and I'm really looking forward to that opportunity.
In Omaha, Taylor Johnson, 6 News.